Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you this evening for a program called New Reality, Coping with the Impact in Our Homes with Dr. Norman Blumenthal from Ohel. I'm Dr. Scott Goldberg, a longtime Passaic resident. I'm an educator and psychologist, and I'll be moderating tonight's program. Again, thank you all for joining. We recognize that we're all under an enormous amount of stress due to COVID-19 and the related situation with our school and shul buildings closed and moving to learning, socializing, and working online. Many of us, Rahman al-Islan, are dealing with health issues of our own and or with family members and financial or work-related issues as well. That's on top of managing our homes and preparing for Pesach. It is a lot. As you surely have heard by now, we're fortunate to have the Rosh Hashiva, community Rabbanim, and lay leaders guiding us. In addition, the Community Task Force has organized a website, a community-specific website for Passaic Clifton, pccovidupdate.com. You'll find up-to-date and accurate information about the pandemic with practical guidelines, educational and parenting information, chizuk from local Rabbanim, a calendar of upcoming programming in the community, women's-specific programming, and more. Again, visit pccovidupdate.com. Now for tonight's program. New Reality, Coping with the Impact in Our Homes. Please note that all participants will remain muted throughout the program, but you may ask questions by emailing townhall@pccovidupdate.com. Again, townhall@pccovidupdate.com. Dr. Norman Blumenthal works for Ohel Children's Home and Family Services and is speaking tonight on behalf of Ohel as a service to our community. Thank you to him and to Ohel for making this possible. For Ohel, he is the Director of Trauma, Bereavement, and Crisis Response, the Zachter Family Chair in Trauma and Crisis Counseling, Director of the Ohel Miriam Center for Trauma, Bereavement, and Crisis Response. He's also Educational Director and Adjunct Professor in the Wexner Kola Elyon and Smicha programs at Yeshiva University, an adjunct professor at the Furkauf Graduate School of Psychology and the Wurzweiler School of Social Work at Yeshiva University. Again, for tonight's program, if you have any questions throughout, please email townhall@pccovidupdate.com, townhall@pccovidupdate.com. Now, please welcome, as I introduced previously, a pillar of the Jewish community who supports us in our most challenging times, Dr. Norman Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, Scott, for that very gracious and probably undeserved introduction. And I want to thank you for everything you do for the community and for mental health professionals and educators. Also, I think we sometimes have to remember to thank the guys behind the scene. And I want to thank Jonathan Reich and anybody else who was involved in putting this together. For those of my generation, we have a particular appreciation for someone who can turn on a computer and make it work. So thank you. And I also want to commend Passaic Clifton community, which has always been a favorite community of mine. In fact, I even allowed my grandchildren to be raised there. And really commend them for all the work they're doing, particularly for this website, which really should be the model for every community, both in terms of provision of services and entertainment, and also filtering information, as we'll talk about shortly, and also acknowledge and reference the Jewish Family Service, as the East, and the wonderful Jewish Family Service that you have in your community that is also stepping up to the plate in these very difficult times. And again, last but certainly not least, I want to acknowledge Ohel and for giving me the opportunity for funding me, for being able to do these various webinars and presentations to help the community, help myself during this very challenging time. I hope that in the merit of everything that we're doing, that everyone who has been afflicted will have a speedy recovery, will have a refuah shlema, and that those of us who have been spared should continue to be spared and should, in the very near future, be able to resume our routine and certainly our connection with others. So tonight, last week, we spoke about working with our children. It's actually very Jewish to worry about your children and put your children's needs ahead of your own. And I've been accused of being Jewish, so I have the comparable priorities, but probably psychologically, we should have done this presentation the other way around. Because as I believe I mentioned last week, first and foremost, you have to be uh, you have to be okay yourself. You have to have a clear perspective yourself. We don't fool children. And if we're distraught and if we're confused and if we're giving mixed messages or trying not to, but have mixed emotions, our children will pick up on them. So we probably should have done it the other way around. But as I said, it's in our nature at an emotional level to put our children first. The other thing I want to mention, and I always have to mention this, that everybody's unique and everybody's an individual. And the more extreme the circumstance, the more of an individual we become. And therefore, we're going to respond in our own unique individual way to this crisis. So what I'm going to say may not be 100% applicable. It's probably not going to be a bullseye, but some pieces may be, some pieces may be less so. Listen, take it seriously, I hope. And whatever resonates with your needs or whatever seems to fit for your particular situation, please take advantage of it. If it doesn't, as I said, we're all very unique and we can't, there's not one size that fits all. Probably the emotion or the emotional state that we're most concerned about in a situation like this is anxiety. And anxiety is interesting and a little tricky. And let me give an example. By the way, I'm going to apologize if some of the things I said last week, there's a lot of things that apply to children, apply to adults as well. So if there's a repetition, I apologize. But, let me give an example. Let's say certain habits that we want to stop. There's some habits that we can go cold turkey. There's some habits that we can get rid of completely. If somebody is smoking cigarettes, there's a very easy solution. You just stop. I mean, we all know that cutting down from 2 packs to 1 pack really does it. Alcoholism, if somebody overdrinks, they can have a very good life without ever indulging in alcohol. But there's some habits that we can't give up completely. If somebody has a tendency to overeat, we can't stop eating. Somebody has a tendency to overspend, we can't stop spending. We have to reach that sort of happy medium, which makes it a little bit more tricky. And the same thing can be said about anxiety. Our goal during this crisis is to temper anxiety, maybe, not to have too much anxiety, but not to have too little either. We have to have the anxiety that's appropriate for the challenges that we're facing, because anxiety is a motivator. Anxiety is an unpleasant state, but when we're anxious, we're motivated. We may be anxious about taking examinations, maybe anxious about job interviews. The younger people may be anxious about dating. If it's an appropriate anxiety, it should be, because these are very serious events, important events, and it motivates us to put our best foot forward. Same thing is true during this crisis. If we have too little anxiety, we're going to be dismissive. We're not going to be sufficiently concerned. We're not going to be sufficiently cautious. And unfortunately, we've seen in our community, the broader community, people who are not taking this as seriously as it should, and there have been some fairly devastating consequences. On the other hand, if we're overly anxious, then first, that's not good for our physical health and for our emotional health. And also then we're not thinking straight. So we have to sort of find ourselves on that continuum of anxiety. And part of it means knowing yourself and knowing where you fall. If your tendency is to get overly anxious, if your tendency is to be sort of, as I said, dismissive or cavalier about these kind of matters, and adjust yourself accordingly. If you're not sure, then talk to people who know you. Talk to your spouse, talk to your parents, talk to your friends. It's an interesting sort of psychological phenomena that we're born with a lot of tendencies, not only physical attributes, even temperament and emotional attributes, but we're not born with a self-concept. Our self-concept evolves from our interactions with others. And if we're not sure about some aspect of our self-concept, then it's important that we sort of reality check with people around ourselves. So one more point, I think that's important here, and I'll sort of mention that last week as well. If you do have a tendency towards anxiety, if you have an anxiety disorder, if you have an obsessive compulsive disorder, if you're struggling with a propensity or family history of depression, and you're afraid now of it coming out, and everything, we're going to get back to this later, everything that was before is going to be more in a crisis situation like this. And now's not the time to cure it. Now's not the time probably to address it. Now's the time to manage it. Try to get quickly to a good equilibrium. And God willing, when this is over, and I hope it's over soon, then we can address it. And we are very effective in the mental health professional with anxiety and depression. And we can help people or obsessive compulsive disorders with some very good empirically proven techniques which at the time when this is over, we can address. But right now, if it means taking medication, we didn't take medication before, then take medication. If it means relying on others to contain your anxiety, rely on others to contain your anxiety. So we're right now managing, we're not curing. Again, I can pause and encourage everybody to enter any kind of questions. Maybe the monitor can interrupt me if some questions came in. Yes.
Sure, there is a question just concerning anxiety related to particularly hospitalizations and sick relatives. If a person themselves gets hospitalized, a relative gets hospitalized, or even if someone passes away, how would you approach that within a family in terms of managing one's anxiety and other related mental health issues?
Right, well, I could take up the rest of the talk, so I'm going to be brief. In fact, I will be giving a presentation actually through Ohel on grief during this time, a time when there isn't normal Shiva and aren't normal funerals, etc. But just very quickly, hospitalization today is a very scary prospect because, as we know, the hospitals are very overloaded. There's limited equipment available, and there's an anticipation that there will be less. And I understand from many calls that we've gotten that people who otherwise would have been hospitalized are being encouraged to stay home because of the limited availability of facilities. And the other part is that very often the person has to be alone, that they cannot be accompanied by family members. And as we're going to talk about shortly, taking on something that big and being alone is very painful. We're going to have to use technology as much as possible and connect as much as possible using technology. And it really is a matter of trying to keep cooler heads. And I think the level of anxiety if a loved one is hospitalized may be so heightened, especially in this climate, that we really have to rely on other people. And we have to rely on friends or physicians, family members to help us and contain us when something of this sort happens. And in terms of a loss, again, it's a very big topic, but grief is necessary. Grief is an important part of transitioning from a life with the person to a life, at least externally, without the person. And the Shiva and the eulogies and the participation in the burial are all very important parts, which we are being, for the most part, almost exclusively deprived of. And that does make the grief more complicated. But keep in mind that the ultimate goal when there's a loss is to preserve the relationship, to preserve the memory, and it'll take more effort under these circumstances. But then again, crisis situations do require additional effort. Again, I invite you, I don't know exactly what it is because I don't have the schedule in front of me, but check the Ohel website. I will be dedicating an entire presentation to the grief process under these circumstances.
Okay, so if I can just jump in, I apologize. We were hearing that there's some technical difficulties with the email for questions. So I'm just going to give an alternative email for those who have questions and for the rest of the talk. So please, if you have questions throughout the talk, please email pccovidupdate.education@gmail.com. Again, pccovidupdate.education@gmail.com. Anytime throughout the presentation, and Dr. Blumenthal will answer them during the talk. Thank you. Please.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. Okay, now, one of the very important considerations, which I think your community has very effectively addressed, is the issue of the source of information. In terms, again, we get back to anxiety, how do you contain anxiety? And the way we get information and the way we get news, and I believe I spoke about that last week, has changed radically in recent years. There's a plethora of sources of information, sources of medical information, sources of news, many of them competing with one another to get our attention, which prompts sometimes more sensationalist type of headlines or claims for certain findings or facts that are far from verified. And also just the sheer volume of information that bombard us, that pop up on our devices, can in and of itself create an undue anxiety. So maybe a silver lining of all this is that we can learn, and all the more importantly, teach our probably older children how to manage the source of information. On the one hand, it's a blessing that we get information quickly and that we have access to so much information. On the other hand, we have to learn how to manage it. We have to control it. It can't control us. And that means knowing what sites to refer to. Again, you have it easy because you have this website that's doing that for you, but know the responsible sites. know the responsible news sources, the relatively unbiased news sources, and to even when you read something, to take it with the proverbial grain of salt. I remember very fondly in my years at YU when I had the special schus of being in the Shia of Rav Aaron Kreiser. Many of you may know what a gadol he was, Zechrono Livracha. And he used to come in every day with the New York Times folded under his armpit, and every once in a while he'd pull out an article, and he would show us how to read it and how to understand it and how to treat it like something, not just passively internalize it. Of course, if certainly Allah has kama v'kama, all the more so today, the kind of information that we have to filter and manage. So this is an important consideration in terms of containing anxiety. What are our sources of information? How much we're going to let in, and we have to take breaks from it as well because the sheer volume will destabilize us. Another thing that's important in terms of living in the 21st century is that we're not used to being vulnerable or helpless. So much is so easily solved. We're so used to quick solutions. We can get on a device and we can, turn on the lights of our house when we're on the other end of the world. We can find out things very quickly. We can communicate with other people so easily and without complications. So being as vulnerable and helpless as we are, as this illness sort of has taken over the world, and we can do little else but hermetically seal our homes to prevent ourselves from getting sick, is a position we're not used to and can engender anxiety. Comparably, and I'm going to get to the moment how to handle that, it's a very humbling experience. And I think we have to, as people, and maybe I should have said this earlier, we have to stop being afraid of our humanity. We have to recognize that this kind of anxiety and these kind of concerns is part of the human condition, and it doesn't make us weak. It bothers me when I see references to how strong someone was because they were unemotional. You don't have to go further than looking at Sefer Bereshis and seeing the Avos who had Amunah and Bitachon and strength that we can imagine, and yet they had the full gamut of emotions. They were sad, they were afraid, they were distraught, and we can be as well. And the only difference is what do we do with those emotions and how do we manage them? But being so vulnerable is a humbling experience. And I will tell you, as the person who you're turning to help you manage the anxiety, that I've had some very difficult times myself. I openly admit it, I'm not embarrassed. That there have been, I wouldn't say days, but there have been portions of the days when I don't know what to do with myself, when I'm crying, where I'm scared, and I have to turn to my spouse and tell her how scared I am. It's okay. And we don't have to run away from that, and it's not a sign of weakness. But this is a very humbling experience, and we have to face that. And the other piece that's important is there's a whole lot of ambiguity, which is, again, something we're not used to in this age of information. We're used to wanting facts, which, again, was what makes us so vulnerable to misinformation, because we want to fill in the suffix, the doubts, the ambiguity with facts when they're not there. And we don't know how long this disease is going to last. We don't know if it's going to rear its ugly head again. We don't know what kind of impact it's going to have on the economy and our lives in general. So I think there are basically two approaches we can take to this humbling experience. Number one, we can remind ourselves historically that every difficult time, whether the difficult time was a plague, was a difficult time, was a financially difficult time, whether it was even warfare or at times of persecution, they had a beginning and middle and an end. And that's not to say that there weren't terrible tragedies that occurred, and it wasn't not to say that we paid a dear price, but we've emerged from it. And there is a cyclical nature to events, and I think we can safely say that this Covid-19 and this coronavirus crisis that we're in right now will have a beginning and a middle and an end. And I think we have to brace ourselves for this difficult time, and we have to daven hard, etc. But we can feel assured that it will have an ending, and we will emerge from this and go back to our shuls and have our weddings again and our jobs and maybe more financial security again as well. That's one approach. The other approach is to surrender to it. And I think for us, as Ma'aminim, as Orthodox Jews, that should be pretty easy, because we do believe that there is Hashem running the world, and that Hashem's ways are beyond our comprehension. I quote the Kotzker Rebbe, I can never believe in a God I could understand. Or as we say every morning in our tefillos, Yismach lev mevakesh Hashem. We're in a way always trying to figure out Hashem because Hashem is beyond our comprehension. And therefore, the fact that there is ambiguity and there is uncertainty is something that can, in a way, strengthen our faith and strengthen our religious observance, and to give into it and surrender to it. I'm reminded as I speak about this a number of years ago, I was touring a substance abuse facility in Israel, and I was invited to see the facility. At the same time, the highest ranking Dati general in the Israeli army, a 3-star general, was invited as well. And I have to say that I found the general much more interesting than the program. But one of the things he said to me that has really stayed with me over the years, he said, we look at generals, great generals, as people who have victories, who triumph over their enemy. He said, one measure of a good general is to know when to give up, to know when to retreat. In fact, I subsequently heard a podcast about the Revolutionary War, and one of the things the speaker said is that George Washington's strength was how skillfully he retreated. He retreated from Brooklyn, he retreated from Manhattan, he retreated from North Jersey. He was a skillful retreater, and that's what made him a great general. And sometimes we have to retreat. Sometimes we have to give in and realize we're not omnipotent. We don't know everything. We can't foretell everything. And that's part of being a religious person, and that's part of maybe one of the lessons we can derive from this experience, and that'll certainly contain our anxiety. Maybe I'll stop here for a second because I covered a lot of material. Are there any further questions that came in?
Question came in concerning, yes, thank you, Dr. Blumenthal. A question came in concerning managing family that in those two different scenarios you just mentioned, have people within the home that are at odds with how to approach things, and that is actually itself a stressor. What advice would you give in that situation?
Okay, so I was going to get to that later, but since the question was asked now, I'll ask that now. Everything that had been is going to be more now. So like I mentioned earlier, if you had anxiety before, you can have more anxiety now. And certainly that applies to relationships as well. We spoke about that last week, probably more in terms of sibling relationships, but that also applies to marital relationships. Now, we're not going to talk now about severely dysfunctional marriages with abuse or with partner violence or anything of that sort. But there might be marriages, or there might be areas, and there might be a good marriage with areas of conflict. There might be a couple that get along very well with each other, but have very different parenting approaches, or there might be a couple who cope very differently with a crisis that's taking place. Again, we can do a lot of good work with marriages. We can do a lot of good work with coordinating parenting, and parenting doesn't have to be 100% coordinated. Sometimes some research is showing now that it's good for children to see people who have differences but respectfully differ. But again, it could very well be that there's some issues that were sufficiently disguised by the fact that everybody was so busy and that everybody's busy with their lives. And now that we're cooped up more and we're on top of each other, and again, because there is additional stress that makes everything, that sort of amplifies everything, and everything else becomes more extreme, that these differences may be more pronounced. What I would strongly suggest under these circumstances is sort of park them, file them. We're going to take care of it. We're going to get to the bottom of it. Right now, again, we're in a crisis situation. We have to find unity. We have to find a way of bringing ourselves together. Some of you may be very familiar with the famous Sharif studies. If you took Psych 101, but it was a situation where somebody was studying competition, and he created in a summer camp a fiercely competitive situation. And he did his observations, and he was ready to leave. The camp owner said, shkayach, I have half the camp ready to kill the other half of the camp, bring them together. And what he basically did was he created an external enemy, external sort of threat, and that united everybody. And we see this all the time. And many people feel that the whole civil rights movement grew out of the fact that African-American and Caucasian soldiers had to serve together in World War II. We're right now in that threatening situation, so we have to face that and unite. And when it's over, don't forget about it. Don't drop it. Bring these issues more to the forefront. Okay, let me go on a little bit with some other issues that are important in terms of understanding these levels of anxiety. One of them is the fact that we're disconnected. And that also exacerbates anxiety. I alluded to that earlier in terms of somebody being in the hospital. A lot of the calls we're getting at our crisis line at Ohel relate to family members who have a loved one in the hospital, and as I said, they can't. The best they can be on the phone with them or call the nurse's station. They can't be there with the person, and that's hair raising. That's hair raising for the person as well. And therefore, but even without such an extreme circumstance, even if we are home, being connected with others, being part of a community, is comforting. Makes us feel more secure. Just let me give you just an example. There was once a famous study that was done where they had a subject from a research assistant who was doing the study cross the bridge halfway, and a subject from the study meet that person halfway across in the middle of the bridge. And then the subject had to assess how attractive the research assistant was. But in one instance, the bridge was steady. In the other instance, the bridge was very shaky. And as many of you may have guessed, in the situation of the shaky bridge, they assess the person as more attractive. Because when we're in a threatening situation, we crave the presence of others, and we want to be, looking there for other people appear more attractive to us. So it's so very important that we maintain our connections. And thank God we have the devices and the technology to do so. And we have to be grateful. And in many respects, I've proposed that this might have been some of the refuah before the Makkah, that we have a way of connecting, and let's make it our business to do so. And that's family members, friends, and community as well. And again, that's where your website is so important. Not only just that you can access information, but that you can see and connect and talk to the people that are our community, which is our source of security. Preserving routine. Again, I'm sure we spoke about this last week, and that has been emphasized a lot, so I won't spend much time on that. But there is something very comforting about having a routine, and it's very hard to do that when you're not going to work, when you're sort of contained or quarantined. And it means getting up at the same time, wearing your work clothing, having a productive day, having your 3 meals a day. Try to preserve the routine as much as you can. Many of us may be familiar with the 3-way machlokes that I saw it in the introduction today, Yaakov, about what's the most important verse of pasuk in the Torah. And one person says it's Shema, which makes sense. One person says kamocha, and the third person says it's the lamb that you bring in the morning for the korban tamid, which is a sacrifice brought every day, and the lamb you bring in the afternoon. And again, someone else says, yes, that's the most important verse, because what secures us and stabilizes us is the maintenance of a routine. And apropos to the issue of maintaining a routine is self-care, which is very harder to maintain, again, when we're threatened, when we feel high levels of anxiety, and when our life is out of sort, and when we're at the home. Many of us associate the home with a more carefree, sort of letting our hair down and relaxing, and therefore we may not be as careful about our eating habits, our sleeping, and of course, very important, exercise, which is much harder to do when your world has been limited to your living room, kitchen, and dining room. But there are some very creative videos and information how to maintain your physical fitness, even in the confines of your home. There's yoga, there's Pilates, there's other types of activities that can keep you toned and healthy. And I don't have to tell you how important being in shape and exercising is to maintaining anxiety. And this has to be preserved as part of your routine as well when you're in these different circumstances. Maybe we can pause here if any questions have come in. Dr. Goldberg, if there's...
None at this time, please.
Okay, all right, very good. So then let me go ahead and we'll finish up and then see if there are any further questions. So I mentioned before, that whatever was before is going to be all the more so now. So we talked about that in terms of certain relationship problems. We talked about that in terms of emotional states, etc. That everything is going to be amplified. The same thing is true with coping mechanisms. Coping mechanisms that you have tried on and relied on in the past will be the ones that you're going to use. Sometimes, again, I ask for forgiveness if I mentioned this last week, but a metaphor I'd like to use is, imagine you're a carpenter and you're building a tool shed. You can experiment. You can try different ways of building. You can try different types of equipment. If you're building an extension on your house, if you're building a bedroom or a living room or something like that, you're going to be all the more careful to use what has worked for you in the past, the materials and the methodology that's worked for you in the past. And we're no different as human beings. When we have a minor problem, we can experiment with different ways of coping. When we have a major problem, we rely on what has worked for us or we believe had worked for us in the past. So we become more of an individual. That's part of the problem of dictating, even from me, to somebody else how you should cope, because certain types of coping mechanisms work well for some people and others don't work for those people. But here it becomes important whether you have, as part of your armamentarium of coping, is healthy outlets or ways of coping or unhealthy ones. So if you have healthy ways of coping, whether it's you have good outlets, whether again it's exercise, it's art, it's music, it could be reaching out to other people, it could be certain ways of thinking, it can be learning and hashkafa and turning to religious sources and turning into your faith and emunah for coping. If those are ways in which you've coped in the past, you're going to use them all the more now. And those are certainly healthy, productive ways of coping. However, we're all human, and we all have a Yetzer Hara, and we all have bad habits. And if there were unhealthy ways in which you've coped in the past, and even if it were some ill-conceived habits or methods that you've mastered, now as the stress is preying on you more, you may resort to them. So we have to be very mindful of that. So if your previous coping mechanisms involve, let's say, alcohol consumption or smoking or temper outbursts, overeating, any of those more kind of harmful, destructive ways of coping, you're going to be more prone. Even as I said, even if you went to Smoke Enders and you went to Alcoholics Anonymous and you've got it under control, when you're threatened and you're confined and when you have worries and concerns like we have now, they can emerge as well. And you have to be all the more vigilant and rely on those who care about you and are there for you to help you manage those. There are a few other, just a handful of more types of methods of coping, which I'd like to share with you, which people have found useful. One of them is gratitude. There's a really incredible body of literature and psychology about how people not just feel gratitude, but actually record and speak out what they're grateful for. And we do it 3 times a day when we say Modin. And it's, I think, a very healthy, I can say I do that myself, is that when I say Modin, I try to think about what in my life I have to be grateful for. But it's a deliberate acknowledgement of gratitude. And people who do that have lower anxiety, have less depression, sleep better, are healthier, are more productive at work. In fact, the research shows that their central nervous system secretes more dopamine and serotonin. So in other words, gratitude is a sort of natural antidepressant and tranquilizer. So especially now, as we're so deprived, and especially now as we're so confined, it's very important that we, in a very deliberate way, acknowledge that which we have to be grateful for. So as we are separated from friends and community, we should take time out, or when we say Modin, to acknowledge how grateful we are that we have those friends, and that we have that community which we hopefully soon will reunite with. As we're confounded to our home, and we're tearing our hair out because of having children around all day with no opportunities to leave, or as my wife likes to say sometimes, that her sheitel is turning gray. If your sheitel is turning gray, it might be a time to stop and be grateful that you have the children. And as you're confined with your spouse, to be grateful that you have your spouse. As you're confined to your home, to be grateful that you have an uncomfortable home. And for that matter, as we do try to connect using technology, as I mentioned earlier, be grateful that we have it, that we have this means of connecting. And this kind of very deliberate gratitude is a way to undo, in some sense, the pressure and strain of being confined and the threat of the illness. I often tell a story, and I've told it before, I apologize, but I remember early in my career, the very first time that a colleague of mine asked me to cover for her. And it was a senior colleague, and I was very flattered. And just to show you how long ago it was, we didn't have cell phones, so we were carrying beepers. And my beeper goes off, and unfortunately, there was one of her patients on the phone. I didn't know who this person was. She didn't identify herself, and she was acutely suicidal. And she's threatening to take her life, and it was my responsibility, a young clinician covering for a mentor, to try to get her stabilized. And in my desperation, I said everything wrong and just made her feel worse and worse. And finally, at one point, she was literally screaming at me and saying, "Dr. Blumenthal, why should I live? Why should I live?" And it must have been Siyata Dishmaya, divine providence, but something came to my head. And I said to her, my mother survived Auschwitz by watching the sunset. She said, if there's something that beautiful in the world, it can't all be bad. And that got her through the week. She was okay. And I often think about that. And sometimes when we're confined to our house, when we have friends and relatives who are sick, when we're worried about finances, when we're wondering how long this is going to be, and so much unknown about this, and we feel so helpless that even our great scientists and leaders are so defeated by this, we should watch a sunset and be grateful for a sunset. Another very useful way of coping, and I have to say that we as a community in the broader world has actually done a marvelous job at this, is humor. And I think some of not all, but some of what has been disseminated, and we're sharing it readily, some of the cartoons, some of the lines, some of the videos are really actually funny. And when you can laugh, and you can laugh at the preposterousness of this situation, it does diminish the pain, and it does diminish the hurt. Now, humor is important for two reasons. Humor, on the one hand, as I said, lightens the load. And on the other hand, though, we also have to keep in mind that it's what humor is. What do we find funny? What makes something funny? And if you think about it, what's humorous, if we dissect the joke, a joke is we lead somebody in a particular direction, and then comes the punchline, and we suddenly we divert them. We take them into a totally different direction, and we actually find that amusing. And in fact, that's the reason why Yitzhak is named Yitzhak. It's not just that Sarah and Avram were giggling. It just was so ironic, so unexpected that a 90-year-old woman would have a baby. So so that's what humor is, and that's really what this situation is. Most of us, until a few weeks ago, were just going through with our lives, planning wonderful Pesach family gatherings or vacations, preparing our children for sleepaway camp, getting ready for graduation, getting ready for Yeshiva University to win the NIT. We were all excited about everything that was happening, and suddenly, out of no place, came this virus and has really just redirected us. So humor is a way of expressing that, just how outlandish and preposterous this is. And again, but the problem with humor, and that's where we have to be careful, because humor is a slippery slope, jokes that are at other people's expenses, either individuals or subgroups of the population or different ethnic groups of the population, or humor that makes someone else's pain, tries to trivialize someone else's pain, is bad humor. It can be more hurtful than helpful. So to laugh about the predicament we're all in, the preposterousness of it, is good and helpful, but we have to be careful that it's not at somebody else's expense, or, as I said, trivializing somebody else's pain. Another very effective way of trying to cope is something we refer to as sometimes meaning making or post-traumatic growth, which is to try to cull or mine from the situation something positive, some lessons we can learn. Like, as I mentioned earlier, we may learn from this how to better process news. We can learn about our minutia, our helplessness, and that no matter how much technology and how fast our airplanes fly, and our driverless cars or whatever else we're inventing, that we're really in Hashem's hands, and can enhance our religious observance. And it's a very personal thing. I can't tell you how to do it. What might work for me might not work for someone else. But to try to see if we can extract, it doesn't make the situation good, and we're not going to delude ourselves. This is a very painful and scary predicament we're in. But we can just chip away a little bit from the senselessness and the pain of it by saying, okay, there's something we gained from it. There's some way in which we've grown. And again, what's right for Reuven is not the same for Shimon, but we should seek that out. And then last, and certainly not least, is what we refer to in psychology as the psychospiritual, which is, again, for us, it's clearly religious observance, it's clearly looking for religious meaning, it's davening, it's learning, it's reading Musar Sfarim, it's whatever, but for everybody, to what spirituality does is it takes us away from the mundane world we live in. For that period of time, we're not cooped up in our homes with rampant illness and everything and the devastating consequences of this illness. We're not surrounded by hypocrisy or hate, or for those few, that brief period of time where it's sort of an otherworldly experience. And we need that. We need, especially now, we need to get away from the pain and oppression of what we're going through at this time. I know sometimes I used to say that what learning does for me, or going to a shiur, and I'm far from someone who spends hours a day learning, but after a whole day in my work and seeing so much pain and so much imperfection, it's nice to have a little glimpse and a little touch with what's perfect. That may have different meaning for you, but let's rely on what we have to give ourselves a break, a vacation from the pressure and the stress, and there's probably a few better ways than seeking out that which is spiritual. And just a parting thought, and then if there are any other further questions or comments, I welcome them, is there's nothing wrong with seeking help. Let's not be afraid of our humanity. This is very trying times, and again, I will admit myself that I need those people who are a support for me. I need them desperately now, as I am afraid, and I am scared of what's happening. So reach out for help if you need it. And reaching out for help can be to your family, reaching out can be friends, it can be clergy, and it can be mental health professionals as well. I will remind you again that Ohel is available. We have a designated email address, which is copingwithcovid19 at ohelfamily.org. That's copingwithcovid19 at ohelfamily.org. We are actually in the process of trying to streamline this and set up maybe more of an online kind of clinic with waiting rooms, etc., where we will be available for confidential remote assistance at no charge. And of course, again, I have to certainly acknowledge and highlight your local Jewish Family Service, which is one of the premier Jewish family services in the tri-state area that has a group going, I believe it's from 9 to 10 every night, if I recall correctly, but go on their website, they will tell you about it, where you can join with others, and support groups in times like this are empirically proven to be extremely helpful and important, and also have a cadre of culturally sensitive and appropriate therapists, well-trained and well-supervised, who are available to remotely help others as well. So take advantage of it. Have it, and one of the beauties, or I guess one of the silver linings of all this, is how we're coming together as a community, and let's take advantage of that. I hope this was helpful, and again, I welcome any questions or anybody who has input about something that I hadn't mentioned.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Blumenthal. A few questions have come in.
Okay.
In these difficult times with cancellations and of simchas, of various events, including the potential of people's graduations being postponed, things like this. There are a number of questions concerning, one, if it's your own, how you might suggest one think about that, and also if it is a friend or a family member, what to say, what not to say. Perhaps you can provide some guidance there.
Sure, that's one of the most common questions we're getting asked, and you just hit it on the nail. It's graduations, it's bar mitzvahs, it's weddings, it's milestones that we've been waiting for. It's your first summer in camp, or your first summer as a camp counselor. That may not happen this year. And it's very hard, and sometimes it's hard for us as adults to appreciate what's so important to children, because we have a lot of years behind us, and we sometimes look back and we have so many experiences, we realize that what seemed so important when we were kids was not so terribly important. I remember as a child, once a day or two before I was supposed to leave for sleepaway camp, I fell during a ball game, and I thought I had broken a bone, and which would have interfered with my summer, and my world was coming to an end. And at this point in my age, I can realize, first, it wasn't the case, and it wouldn't have been. But these are important, and I think the worst we can do is try to downplay it and say it's no big deal. It is a big deal. It's a very big deal. A bar mitzvah boy who had been working all year to prepare his bar mitzvah and is not going to have a bar mitzvah, that's very devastating. And there's nothing more comforting than being validated. And what I would really strongly suggest is, don't try to make it less important. Yes, tell them that when this is over, we'll have a celebration, and mention to them that we will try to make it up to them as best we can, but it's going to be a poor substitution. It's going to be a diluted celebration, and just validate it for them. And there's very few things more comforting than being validated. And I think that's probably the most important thing we can do for these people.
Great. Just a reminder that you can email questions to PC, as in Passaic Clifton, PC COVID update.education@gmail.com, PC COVID update.education@gmail.com. Another question, Dr. Blumenthal, concerns elderly parents and communicating information. How much is too much? Is it really individualized? In a sandwich generation, there are people who are asking, a number of people have asked questions related to how to communicate, both just generally and also if one has symptoms, whether or not to share that or whether or not that might actually raise anxiety and the like.
Sure.
So
And let me amplify that question by mentioning that even if you have to share some disconcerting news with older parents or grandparents, great grandparents nowadays, we can reference. We're not there to be with them. We can't offer them face-to-face comfort. So we may have to impart information and at the same time have to try to offer them assistance as best we can remotely, which complicates it all the more. The best, if there's a default position, then we share, then we inform, because there's probably, as upsetting as any kind of information can be, not knowing, as I mentioned earlier, I talked about ambiguity, the state of ambiguity itself engenders anxiety, and sometimes even hearing bad news is easier than being in that kind of state of limbo and not knowing one way or the other. And again, an elderly parent may suspect that their child doesn't sound healthy, or they haven't heard from that particular grandchild for a while. If they're worrying and you're not telling, that can be more devastating. On the other hand, if they are medically frail and you're not there to be with them and they don't need to know, sometimes it's a judgment call, case-by-case judgment call, and I would seek out advice. These are very complicated questions, but we might then refrain from sharing that kind of information. But if you're not sure, or if it seems that the person suspects something, then we're better off telling. And I will tell you something, as somebody who does, one of the areas of work I do is what's often referred to as death notification, or I have to participate in sometimes sharing devastating information. I find that the elderly handle it pretty well. They have a lot of life experience. They've a lot under their belt, and not to say they're not having an emotional response, but sometimes I sense that they have a perspective that many of us don't have, and they handle it pretty well. So let's not treat them like China dolls.
There's a question concerning those who the person asked said are on the front lines, medical doctors, medical staff, nurses, other medical experts and professionals, teachers, educators who are on the front lines. What advice do you have for them in terms, any additional advice in terms of
Sure.
both balancing the work and the home in terms of coping?
Okay, I hope I don't sound like I'm tooting my horn, but I did dedicate a speech to nursing care facilities and to janitorial staff, which is on the Ohel website and also available through YouTube. So if anybody's in that position, they want to listen to it, it's available. A lot of it is overlapping with what I spoke about today. But I think all of us, or I'm not included, but I think those of you who are trying to homeschool children probably have escalating respect for our teachers now, and that we probably didn't have previously. But these are the unsung heroes, and these are people who are taking risks that society does continue, even if it's largely halted, but that some basic services and needs are being provided. And we have to be very grateful to them, and they're not all necessarily department heads and world-renowned scientists. Many of them are our janitorial staff, our food service providers, are people that are caring for those who cannot care for themselves, and they have to be commended enormously, because, as I said, they are taking risks for the betterment of our world and for the perpetuation of our life as we know, and hope we will resume soon. For those people, pat yourself on the back and acknowledge openly. It's not being, it's not gaiva. It's not being, show-offish, arrogant. You're doing some very hard work. You're taking more risks than most people are, and you should be proud of it. And I think there's nothing wrong with it if it helps you get through that time. And the other message, I think that's important for those who are in that position, is when, at first, our tendency is when we're in a dangerous situation, when we're first starting, we tend to be hyper alert, we're hyper careful. And after a while, we kind of, get sometimes a little careless and maybe cavalier about safety, and warn them to please treat every day as if it's the first day, and exercise the utmost caution. so that you're safe and that you're protected as well. And know your limits, and to make sure that you can communicate those limits, and have at your availability when you're done with a very stressful day like this is very appropriate outlets and healthy outlets and ways of stress inoculation.
Great, thank you so much. Any final thoughts before we close the program tonight, Dr. Blumenthal?
Final thoughts? Okay, again, I just want to commend the community, commend Dr. Goldberg and everybody else who participated in this. This is what it's about. This is, I think, when this is all over, and there's going to be no question that this is going to stay with us. Like any climactic event in life, we get through it, but we carry scars and lessons with us. And I think, and we have to be prepared, by the way, and I hope it happens soon, that the reacclimation to life, a lot of the research shows that when people have been quarantined, you don't just fall right back into your routine. It's an adjustment to get back into the routine. But I think we should think very deliberately about what we're going to take with us. And one of them might be everything that's happening here, appreciation for community, appreciation for sharing. And we should even continue that, even if it isn't as urgently needed when all this is over, and take it with us and be better people in a better community.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Blumenthal and again, Ohel Children's Home and Family Services for making tonight possible for our community. The recording of this program will be posted again on our Community Task Force website, pccovidupdate.com, pccovidupdate.com, where you'll find not only this recording, but other recordings of Dr. Blumenthal from last week, as well as programs that we've had in the community and upcoming programs, general programs, mental health programs, parenting programs, programs specifically for women, as well as clear, concise information concerning COVID-19 pandemic. We encourage you again to visit pccovidupdate.com. Thank you again, Dr. Blumenthal, and thank you all for joining us this evening.
Have a good night and stay healthy. Everybody should be well.